The late autumn wind cut through Thomas Blackwood's worn cotton jacket as he trudged along the railroad tracks outside of Millhaven, Montana. At 43, Thomas had spent nearly 2 decades drifting across the American frontier, picking up odd jobs where he could: ranch hand, lumberjack, railway worker, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. His calloused hands deep in his pockets, Thomas walked with the measured pace of a man accustomed to covering long distances on foot. The setting sun painted the vast Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples, but Thomas paid little mind to the beauty. He was focused on reaching the next town before nightfall, where he hoped to find work at one of the logging camps rumored to be hiring for the winter season. The sound reached him first, faint but unmistakable. Thomas paused, cocking his head. A cry, high-pitched and fragile, carried on the wind. He might have dismissed it as an animal or a trick of the breeze whistling through the pines, but something made him turn toward the sound. Following the cries, Thomas veered off the tracks toward a small creek that ran parallel to the railway. The crying grew louder as he approached a cluster of willow trees, bent low over the water. There, partially hidden among the drooping branches and tall reeds, sat a small bundle wrapped in a faded quilt. "Lord Almighty," Thomas muttered, crouching down beside the bundle. Inside was an infant, no more than a few months old, face red from crying, tiny fists balled up in distress. The quilt, though worn, was clean and carefully wrapped around the baby to protect against the autumn chill. Thomas glanced around, searching for any sign of the child's parents. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing across the empty landscape. "Anyone there?" Only the rustling of the trees and the gurgle of the creek answered him. Looking back at the infant, who had momentarily quieted at the sound of his voice, Thomas carefully adjusted the quilt to better see the child. It was a girl, with wisps of dark hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. As Thomas studied her face, her tiny hand escaped the confines of the quilt. That's when he saw it, a birthmark on her small palm, dark against her pink skin, coiled in a distinctive pattern that resembled a snake. "What happened to you, little one?" Thomas whispered. "Who would leave you out here all alone?" The baby stared back at him with solemn eyes, as if trying to communicate something beyond her capabilities. Then her face crumpled, and she began to cry again. Thomas had never been one for sentimentality. Life on the frontier had hardened him, taught him to look after himself first and foremost. But something about this abandoned child stirred feelings he'd long thought buried, memories of the family he'd once dreamed of having, before the war, before he'd lost his way. With the sun sinking rapidly behind the mountains, Thomas knew he had to make a decision. The nearest town was still a few miles ahead, and the temperature would drop quickly once darkness fell. Leaving the baby where he found her wasn't an option. She wouldn't survive the night. "All right then," he said, carefully lifting the bundle. "I suppose we're headed to town together." The baby quieted as Thomas held her against his chest, her tiny body warm through the quilt. He adjusted his pack, then set off toward Millhaven with more purpose in his stride than before. As he walked, Thomas considered what awaited them in town. The sheriff would need to be notified, inquiries would be made. Someone would come forward to claim the child, surely. If not, there was the orphanage in Helena, though he'd heard troubling things about such places. "Just temporary, you understand," he told the baby, who had drifted to sleep in his arms. "I'll get you somewhere safe, somewhere proper." But even as he said the words, Thomas felt something shift inside him. A door long closed, creaking open, just a fraction. The weight of the child in his arms felt both foreign and strangely familiar, as if he'd been carrying an emptiness all these years, without realizing it. The lights of Millhaven appeared in the distance as darkness settled over the landscape. Thomas looked down at the sleeping infant, at the snake-shaped mark on her tiny hand, and made a silent promise, not just to deliver her to safety, but to ensure that whatever happened next would be in her best interest. What that meant exactly, he wasn't yet sure. The Millhaven Sheriff's Office was a modest wooden structure with a tin roof that pinged loudly as the late evening rain began to fall. Sheriff Daniel Hayes, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper mustache, studied Thomas across his desk with skeptical eyes. "And you just found her?" "By the creek off Railroad Road." The sheriff's pencil hovered above his notepad. Thomas nodded, standing awkwardly in the middle of the office, still holding the baby, who had begun to fuss. Yes, sir. Wrapped in this quilt, nothing else around her. The sheriff's deputy, a young man named Ellis, peered over at the infant. She looks healthy enough. Probably wasn't out there long. Any identifying information with her? A note, perhaps? Sheriff Hayes asked. Thomas shook his head. Nothing. Just her and the quilt. The sheriff sighed, setting down his pencil. I'll send telegrams to the surrounding towns, see if anyone's reported a missing infant. In the meantime, he trailed off, eyeing Thomas. You say you're just passing through. That's right. Looking for work at the logging camps. Well, the nearest orphanage is in Helena, 3 days' journey from here. Mrs. Holloway, the midwife, might be persuaded to take the child temporarily, but she's already caring for her ailing mother. Thomas shifted his weight, looking down at the baby girl. Her eyes were open now, gazing up at him with an intensity that unsettled him. The snake-shaped birthmark on her palm was visible as she reached up toward his face. I could. Thomas hesitated, surprised by the words forming in his mouth. I could care for her. Until you find her people. Sheriff Hayes raised his eyebrows. You. No offense, Mr. Blackwood, but you're a drifter by your own admission. What do you know about caring for an infant? It was a fair question. Thomas had never raised a child, had barely been around children since his own childhood. Yet as he stood in that small-town sheriff's office, with rain hammering the roof, he couldn't bring himself to hand over the baby to strangers. I was the oldest of 6, Thomas said, the memories of his Pennsylvania childhood surfacing. Helped my mother with the young ones before I left home. I know enough to keep her fed and clean. The sheriff exchanged a dubious glance with his deputy. Even so, it's highly irregular. Just until you find her family, Thomas pressed. I've rented a room at the boarding house. I can get what she needs. Seems better than shipping her off to Helena with strangers. After a long moment, Sheriff Hayes sighed again. Mrs. Peterson at the general store lost her daughter in childbirth last spring. She might have some baby things she'd be willing to part with, and I expect you to check in here daily, so I can update you on my inquiries. Relief washed over Thomas, though it was quickly followed by apprehension. What did he know about caring for a baby in this day and age? But looking at the child in his arms, he felt a strange certainty that this was the right course. Does she have a name? Deputy Ellis asked. Something to call her by? Thomas hesitated. Naming her seemed presumptuous, as if he was claiming her somehow. Yet she needed to be called something. Lily, he said finally, the name coming to him unbidden. After my mother. The next morning found Thomas at Mrs. Peterson's general store, the baby, Lily, bundled in his arms. Mrs. Peterson, a plump woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, took one look at Thomas and the infant and sprang into action. A man knows nothing about babies, she declared, leading Thomas around the store. You'll need proper milk bottles, diapers, a cradle if you can afford it. How long do you plan to care for her? Just until her family is found, Thomas replied, though the words felt hollow as Lily gripped his finger with surprising strength. Mrs. Peterson's eyes softened as she watched the interaction. That mark on her hand, distinctive, isn't it? Should make identifying her people easier, if they're looking. If, Thomas repeated quietly. By midday, Thomas had transformed his sparse room at the boarding house into a makeshift nursery. Mrs. Peterson had been generous, offering him baby items at reduced prices and throwing in extras. A soft blanket, a small stuffed bear, a rattle carved from wood. Sitting on the edge of his bed, watching Lily sleep in a wooden cradle borrowed from Mrs. Peterson, Thomas contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. He'd come to Millhaven seeking temporary work before moving on, as he always did. Now he found himself responsible for a small life, tied to this town until Lily's family was found. If they were found. Just temporary, he reminded himself, though even as he said it, he wondered if he was trying to convince himself of something he no longer believed. A week passed, then 2. Sheriff Hayes sent telegrams to every town within 100 miles, but no reports of a missing infant matched Lily's description. No one came forward to claim a baby with a snake-shaped birthmark. It happens sometimes, the sheriff told Thomas during one of his daily check-ins. Unmarried mothers, families who can't afford another mouth to feed. They leave babies where they'll be found. Tragic, but not uncommon. Thomas nodded, bouncing Lily gently in his arms. At nearly 4 months old, by Mrs. Peterson's estimation, she had begun to show more personality, smiling at Thomas, following him with her eyes as he moved around their small room, cooing and babbling when he spoke to her. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Well, there's still the orphanage in Helena," Sheriff Hayes said, watching Thomas carefully. "Or there are other options." The implication hung in the air between them. Thomas could leave Lily at the orphanage and continue on his way, or he could make a more permanent arrangement. The thought of walking away from her now seemed impossible, yet the alternative terrified him just as much. "I've never stayed in one place more than a season," Thomas said quietly. "Never had reason to." The sheriff nodded. "A child changes things, gives a man roots, purpose, but it's not a decision to make lightly." That evening, Thomas sat by the window of his boarding house room, Lily asleep on his chest. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, blanketing Millhaven in white. The logging camp had offered him work, good pay that would see them through the winter. Mrs. Peterson had found him a small cabin to rent on the edge of town, more suitable for a man with a child than the boarding house. All signs pointed toward staying, toward a life Thomas had never imagined for himself. It both terrified and exhilarated him. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas carefully stood, holding Lily against him as he opened the door to find Mrs. Peterson. "I've brought some supper," she said, holding out a covered dish. "And news." Sheriff Hayes received a response from a town called Clearwater, about 80 miles east. "A young woman went missing around the time you found Lily. Hannah Miller, 19 years old, unmarried and reportedly with child." Thomas felt his heart constrict. "They think she's Lily's mother?" Mrs. Peterson set the dish down on the small table. "They're not certain. The girl's family is strict. Religious folk who didn't take kindly to her condition. She disappeared one night. They assumed she'd run off to have the baby somewhere else. But they don't know for certain." "No, and given the circumstances." Mrs. Peterson hesitated. "The family has shown little interest in finding her or the child. Sheriff Hayes says without proof, there's nothing compelling them to take responsibility for Lily." Relief washed over Thomas, followed immediately by guilt. Somewhere, a young woman might be searching desperately for her child. Or worse, might never search at all. "Thank you for telling me," Thomas said quietly. Mrs. Peterson studied him for a moment. "You've grown attached to her." It wasn't a question, but Thomas nodded anyway. "I have." The town council meets tomorrow evening. Sheriff Hayes will present Lily's case. If no conclusive evidence of her family appears, decisions will need to be made about her future. Mrs. Peterson reached out, gently touching Lily's dark hair. "You should attend, make your intentions known." After she left, Thomas paced the small room, Lily still sleeping soundly against him. He'd spent his adult life avoiding responsibility, drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs, moving on when things got complicated. The war had left him hollow, unwilling to form attachments that could be so easily severed by fate or circumstance. Yet here he was, contemplating putting down roots for a child who wasn't his by birth, but had somehow claimed a place in his heart. By morning, Thomas had made his decision. He attended to Lily with a new sense of purpose, then made his way to the town hall that evening, the baby bundled warmly against the December cold. The council members, 5 men and 2 women representing Millhaven's prominent families, listened as Sheriff Hayes presented the facts of Lily's case. When he finished, the council head, a stern-faced banker named Williams, turned to Thomas. "Mr. Blackwood, you've cared for this child since discovering her. What are your thoughts on her future care?" Thomas stood, Lily secure in his arms, her small hand with the snake-shaped mark visible as she reached toward the council members, curious about these new faces. "My thoughts, sir," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. are that I'd like to make this temporary arrangement permanent. I'd like to adopt Lily as my daughter." Spring came to Millhaven, melting the snow and bringing new life to the Montana landscape. The small cabin Thomas had rented on the edge of town now bore signs of permanent residence. A vegetable garden taking shape behind the house, curtains in the windows, a rocking chair on the porch where he often sat with Lily in the evenings. The adoption had been finalized in February, a surprisingly simple process in a frontier town where practical matters often outweigh bureaucracy. Sheriff Hayes had provided a letter attesting to Thomas's character and the circumstances of Lily's discovery. The town council, satisfied that no one had come forward to claim the child despite extensive inquiries, had approved the petition. A judge passing through on circuit had signed the necessary papers, and Lily Blackwood had officially become Thomas's daughter. Now, as Thomas worked in the garden while Lily napped inside, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 6 months. He had steady work at the sawmill, having proven himself a reliable and skilled worker during the winter at the logging camp. He had acquaintances in town who nodded and greeted him by name. Mrs. Peterson had become something of a grandmother figure to Lily, offering advice and occasional childcare when Thomas needed to work odd hours. For the first time since before the war, Thomas felt connected to a place and its people. Morning, Blackwood. The call came from the road, where Jim Ellis, the sheriff's deputy, rode past on horseback. "Fine day for planting." Thomas straightened, wiping his brow. "Indeed it is. Any news from town?" Ellis reined in his horse. "Railroad's hiring. They're extending the line west. Need strong backs. Pays better than the mill, I hear." In his previous life, Thomas might have jumped at such an opportunity. Railroad work had been his mainstay for years, temporary, lucrative, perfect for a man with no attachments. Now he simply nodded in acknowledgement. "I appreciate the information," he said, "but I'm content where I am." Ellis smiled knowingly. "Figured as much. Oh, almost forgot. Mrs. Peterson asked me to remind you about the spring social this weekend. Says it's high time Lily got to know the other little ones in town." After the deputy rode on, Thomas returned to his planting, considering the invitation. The idea of attending a town social made him uneasy. He'd never been one for gatherings, but he understood the importance of Lily having a normal childhood, complete with friends and community events. Inside the cabin, a cry announced that Lily had awakened from her nap. Thomas dusted the soil from his hands and went to her, finding her standing in her crib, her dark hair tousled from sleep. "There's my girl," he said, lifting her. At nearly 10 months old, Lily was growing quickly, developing a personality that both delighted and challenged Thomas daily. She was curious and determined, already trying to walk by holding onto furniture, examining everything within reach with intense focus. The snake-shaped birthmark on her palm remained distinctive, occasionally drawing curious glances from strangers. Thomas had grown protective whenever he noticed such attention, wary of the superstitions that sometimes surrounded unusual birthmarks. But in Millhaven, most had accepted Lily as simply another child in their community, birthmark or no. That Saturday, Thomas found himself at the spring social, held in the meadow beside the church. Tables laden with food lined one side, while children of various ages played games across the grass. Thomas stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, Lily perched on his hip, taking in the scene with wide eyes. "Thomas Blackwood, I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," Mrs. Peterson said, approaching with a warm smile. "And little Lily, don't you look pretty today?" Lily babbled happily at the familiar face, reaching for Mrs. Peterson, who took her with practiced ease. "There are several children around Lily's age," Mrs. Peterson said, nodding toward a blanket spread on the grass, where mothers sat with infants and toddlers. "Sarah Miller's boy is just learning to walk, and the Wilson twins are about Lily's age. It would do her good to play with other children." Thomas hesitated. "I'm not sure I—" "Go mingle," Mrs. Peterson interrupted firmly. "Meet your neighbors properly. I'll introduce Lily to the little ones." Left with little choice, Thomas found himself drawn into conversation with other men from town, the blacksmith, a rancher from outside Millhaven, several workers from the sawmill. To his surprise, the interactions came more easily than expected. These men respected hard work and straightforward talk, qualities Thomas possessed in abundance. They asked about his experience in different territories, shared local knowledge about hunting grounds and fishing spots, debated the merits of various tools and techniques. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the meadow, Thomas realized he had spent hours in easy conversation. Looking across the gathering, he spotted Lily sitting on a blanket with other children, Mrs. Peterson watching over them as they played with wooden toys. Something settled in Thomas's chest, a sense of belonging he had not felt in decades. Millhaven was becoming more than just a place to stay temporarily. It was becoming home. 5 years passed, each season adding another layer to the roots Thomas and Lily had put down in Millhaven. The cabin had expanded, a second bedroom added when Lily outgrew sharing space with her father, a proper kitchen built when Thomas realized cooking was a skill he both needed and enjoyed developing. The garden flourished, providing vegetables throughout summer and into fall. Lily, now nearly 6 years old, had grown into a spirited child with her father's quiet determination and a curiosity entirely her own. Her dark hair hung in thick braids down her back, and her storm-colored eyes missed nothing. She attended the town school, where she showed an aptitude for reading that made her teacher, Miss Hammond, predict a bright future. "She's reading at twice the level of children her age," Miss Hammond told Thomas during their quarterly meeting. "She asks questions most adults wouldn't think to ask." Thomas nodded, pride warming his chest. "She's always been observant. The other children respect her, too. She's kind, but she doesn't let anyone take advantage of her kindness." Miss Hammond hesitated. She did have some trouble with the Cooper boy last week. He made some comment about her birthmark, called it a snake curse, or some such nonsense. Thomas stiffened. What happened? Lily told him that snakes are symbols of wisdom in many cultures, and that her mark simply meant she was smarter than him. Miss Hammond smiled. Then she proved it by solving an arithmetic problem he couldn't manage. That evening, as Thomas helped Lily prepare for bed, he noticed her studying the birthmark on her palm. The snake's shape had remained clear as she grew, coiling from the base of her palm toward her index finger. "Does it bother you?" he asked gently. "What the Cooper boy said?" Lily shrugged, climbing into bed. "Not really. Billy Cooper believes in monsters under his bed, too. Mrs. Peterson says some people fear what they don't understand." Thomas smiled, pulling the quilt, the same one she had been wrapped in when he found her, over her shoulders. "Mrs. Peterson is a wise woman." "Papa," Lily's voice grew serious, "will you tell me again about how you found me?" It was a story she requested often, especially before bed. Thomas settled into the chair beside her bed and recounted the tale. The walk along the railroad tracks, the cry carried on the wind, the discovery by the creek. He told it plainly, without embellishment, answering her questions honestly when she asked why her birth parents had left her. "Sometimes people make difficult choices," he explained, as he always did. "But I'm grateful every day that I was the one who found you." "Me too," Lily said, her eyes growing heavy. "I think we were supposed to be a family." The words, simple and sincere, stayed with Thomas long after Lily had fallen asleep. Summer arrived, bringing with it the town's Independence Day celebration. The main street was decorated with bunting and flags, and a dance was planned in the newly built town hall. Lily had been practicing a recitation with her class, proudly memorizing a passage from the Declaration of Independence to perform before the townspeople. As Thomas helped her prepare that morning, a knock came at the door. Expecting Mrs. Peterson, who had promised to help with Lily's hair, Thomas was surprised to find Sheriff Hayes on his porch instead. "Morning, Thomas," the sheriff said, his expression serious. "Might I have a word?" "Privately." Thomas glanced back at Lily, who was practicing her recitation in front of the mirror. "Lily, I need to speak with the sheriff." "Stay inside, please." Outside, Hayes removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a gesture Thomas had learned indicated discomfort. "A woman arrived on yesterday's train. She's been asking questions about a child found near here some years back. A child with a distinctive birthmark." Thomas felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Who is she?" "Says her name is Hannah Miller. From Clearwater." Hayes watched Thomas carefully. "She's claiming to be Lily's mother." The name connected immediately to the information Mrs. Peterson had shared years earlier, the young unmarried woman who had disappeared, reportedly with child. "What does she want?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "To see her daughter." Hayes sighed. "She has a story, Thomas. Says her family forced her to give up the baby. Told her the child had died. She only recently learned the truth from her dying father, that they had left the infant near the railroad, hoping someone would find her." Thomas leaned against the porch railing, his mind racing. "And the birthmark? How would she know about that?" "Says it runs in her family. Her grandmother had the same mark." Hayes placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "She's at the hotel in town. Wants to meet with you first, before approaching Lily. Says she understands what you've done for her daughter. Doesn't want to disrupt Lily's life." Inside the cabin, Lily's voice rose in clear recitation. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, then straightened his shoulders. "Tell her I'll meet with her. After today's celebration. Lily has been practicing her recitation for weeks. I won't ruin this day for her." As the sheriff nodded and turned to leave, Thomas added quietly, "And Hayes, Lily is my daughter. In every way that matters." "I know that, Thomas," the sheriff replied gently. "But there are questions that need answering, for Lily's sake as much as anyone's." Thomas watched him right away, then turned back toward the cabin, toward the sound of Lily's voice, toward the life they had built together, a life now threatened by ghosts from the past he had never expected to confront. The story of Thomas and Lily Blackwood, it seemed, was far from over. The Independence Day celebration proceeded with all the fanfare small-town America could muster in 1887. Flags waved from every porch, children ran with sparklers as darkness fell, and the townspeople gathered to hear speeches, poetry, and recitations from the schoolchildren. Thomas sat in the front row, his heart swelling with pride as Lily delivered her portion of the Declaration of Independence flawlessly, her clear voice carrying across the crowd. She found his eyes as she finished, beaming at his approving nod. Yet beneath his smile, Thomas's thoughts churned. Throughout the day, he found himself scanning the crowd, wondering if Hannah Miller was among the onlookers, already watching the daughter she had lost. The sheriff had promised she would wait for their arranged meeting, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of impending change. As the fireworks began, lighting the Montana sky with brilliant colors, Thomas held Lily on his shoulders so she could see better. Her small hands, one bearing the distinctive snake-shaped mark, gripped his hair for balance. "It's the best day ever, Papa," she declared, her face illuminated by the red and blue bursts overhead. Thomas tightened his hold on her legs. "Yes, it is," he agreed, committing the moment to memory, fearful it might be one of their last. The following morning, Thomas asked Mrs. Peterson to watch Lily while he attended to business in town. He dressed in his best shirt, the one he'd worn to sign Lily's adoption papers, and walked to the Millhaven Hotel with leaden steps. Sheriff Hayes was waiting in the lobby. "She's in the dining room," he said quietly. "I can stay if you want." Thomas shook his head. "This is between us." Hannah Miller sat alone by the window, a cup of untouched tea before her. Thomas recognized her immediately. Lily had her eyes, the same storm gray that could shift from thoughtful to determined in an instant. She was young, perhaps 25 now, with the same dark hair as Lily, though streaked prematurely with strands of silver. She rose as Thomas approached, her hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for meeting me." Thomas nodded stiffly, taking the seat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of their shared connection to Lily hanging between them. "I saw her yesterday," Hannah finally said, "at the celebration. I know I promised to wait, but I couldn't. I had to see her. She's beautiful. And her recitation, she's clearly very bright." "She is," Thomas agreed, studying the woman who had given birth to his daughter. "Sheriff Hayes told me your story, about your family forcing you to give her up." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "They told me she died at birth, that God had punished me for my sin by taking my baby. I believed them. I was barely 19, terrified, in so much pain. She wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. It was only when my father was dying last month that he confessed the truth, that they had taken her and left her where someone might find her. He gave me the quilt I had made for her, said they had wrapped her in it. A faded blue quilt with yellow stitching around the edges, Thomas said quietly. Hannah nodded, fresh tears spilling. So it's true. You found her. You raised her. I did. I have. Thomas's voice grew firm. She's my daughter, Mrs. Miller. I know. Hannah looked down at her hands. I'm not here to take her from you, Mr. Blackwood. When my father told me what they had done, I had to know if she survived, if she was safe. That's all I came for, to know that she's well. Thomas hadn't expected this. He had prepared himself for a fight, for legal claims and bitter arguments over rights to Lily. This simple desire to know her daughter was alive and thriving caught him off guard. Why should I believe you? He asked, still wary. Hannah reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded paper, placing it on the table between them. This is the deed to my grandmother's house in Clearwater. She left it to me when she died. I've signed it over to Lily, to be held in trust until she turns 18. She met Thomas's gaze directly. I'm married now, to a kind man who knows my past. We have 2 sons. I have a family, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not looking to reclaim what was taken from me. I just want to know my daughter. Thomas unfolded the deed, scanning the legal language, the legitimate signatures and notary stamp. What exactly are you asking for? A chance to meet her, to be someone in her life, an aunt perhaps, a family friend, someone who can tell her about her birth family someday, when she's old enough to understand, and perhaps letters, to know how she grows, what she becomes. Hannah's voice broke slightly. I don't deserve more than that. I know what she calls Papa. The sincerity in her words reached Thomas, touching something in him that understood the complex bonds of family. Not always by blood, not always perfect, but sacred nonetheless. 3 days later, Thomas and Lily walked hand in hand to the park in the center of Millhaven. Lily skipped alongside him, curious about the friend her father wanted her to meet. Hannah sat on a bench near the small pond, nervously smoothing her skirt. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening at the sight of Lily up close. Thomas knelt before his daughter. Lily, this is Mrs. Miller. She knew your birth mother. Lily studied Hannah with those perceptive gray eyes, her eyes, taking in the woman's familiar features with the innocent curiosity of childhood. You have the same color eyes as me, she observed. Hannah smiled tremulously. Yes, I do. And Lily hesitated, then held out her palm, showing her birthmark. Do you know about this too? With hands that shook slightly, Hannah turned over her own palm, pushing back her sleeve to reveal a faint but unmistakable mark in the same shape, though faded with time. Lily's eyes widened. You're like me. Yes, Hannah whispered, looking up at Thomas with gratitude in her eyes. In some ways, I am. Thomas watched as his daughter, for she would always be his daughter, took a tentative step toward her birth mother. The pain he had expected to feel was there, but alongside it was something unexpected, a sense of rightness, of completion. Lily deserved to know her history, her origins, and he was secure enough in their bond to allow this connection to grow. As Lily began to excitedly tell Hannah about her school, her friends, and her papa, who could build anything, Thomas sat beside them on the bench, his presence a silent reminder of the promise Hannah had made, not to replace him, but to enrich the family he and Lily had forged together. Family, Thomas realized, watching the 2 dark heads bent together, was not defined by blood alone, nor by legal documents. It was built day by day, through love and sacrifice, through honesty and forgiveness, through the courage to embrace the complicated truth that bound them all together. And in that moment, under the summer sun in a small Montana town, the family that had begun with a drifter finding an abandoned baby with a snake-shaped mark expanded to include one more person who would love Lily Blackwood for exactly who she was.